Good morning. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank George and the committee for holding this event. It obviously is a very important issue. Religious persecution and the threats to religious liberty are spreading throughout the world and are very important for us to confront. Obviously, some of this situation comes from oppressive governments. Some of it comes from conflicts within society among different groups, discriminating particularly against minority faiths. But also we see the impact that war has on religious communities. We've seen where even in cases where we've pursued regime change against oppressive governments, where that has destabilized countries and where some faith communities have ended up at even greater risk than before. Some have been displaced from their homes, some have become, seen their populations shrink. So we're going to talk about a lot of these different issues today, and hopefully we'll consider some solutions and we'll come away with a better understanding of what leads to some of these threats to religious liberty and greater understanding of different faith communities throughout our world. Today's keynote speaker is former Senator Rick Santorum, who's been active on the religious liberty front throughout his career. He served in the House from the state of Pennsylvania, and then served 2 terms in the United States Senate, was where religious issues and life issues and national security were major focuses of his Senate career. He twice sought the Republican presidential nomination, and in 2012 was winner of the Iowa caucuses and the runner-up to Mitt Romney, the eventual nominee. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the senator and have him come talk to us this morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go. We want you guys to get fired up. There's a great panel afterward, and we want you to drill them with a lot of great questions. I am here to welcome you, but to give you a couple of things to think about, at least from my perspective, when dealing with this issue. As you just heard, I was a member of Congress for 16 years, 4 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, and ran for president twice. And one of the things, having sort of dabbled in now both areas, both being in Congress and running for president, and thinking about the role of the executive, one of the things that troubles me the most when I think about this issue of religious liberty and of the issue of the impact of war on religious freedom around the world, I think about the role of the president and the role of Congress. And as a member of Congress, I was very active on the issue of religious liberty. It was just mentioned, but I started a working group, a bipartisan, bicameral group on the issue of religious liberty. And the reason I did, it's not because I was thinking about running for president and I wanted to brandish my credentials on that, but it was because what I saw in Congress was a Congress that was wholly inattentive to those issues. You had, and you probably still have today, a handful of members. I suspect Chris Smith, you probably all know Chris Smith, because Chris Smith has been doing this for a long time, but Frank Wolf did it in the day when I was there. But you can probably mention 2 or 3 other members of Congress who seem to focus or care at all about this issue. Why? Well, because it's not an election issue. It doesn't get anybody excited back home when you talk about this issue from an international point of view. Now, it may, increasingly so, religious liberty is an issue that is important here in the U.S., and we're seeing some serious conversation about it. But even today, when this issue is a hot-button issue here in the United States, it's not a hot-button issue in congressional districts and Senate races around the country. And as a result, people are driven by their own fortunes to pay attention to issues that matter to their constituents. And that's where they tend to focus a lot of their time and energy. The problem with that is that we leave this issue primarily to the executive, and it all depends on whether the executive is engaged in this issue or not, as to whether you're going to have any kind of movement on this front. I mean, we had a president then set up the International Commission on Religious Liberty, put a religious liberty ambassador. We have former Senator Governor Brownback in that position. So for President Bush, this was an important issue for him, but subsequent presidents, not so much. And if you don't have some mainstay in Congress to keep this issue alive, more than a half a dozen members, then this issue is never going to be a central issue of importance for the American government. You can't just have, no offense to the State Department, you can't just have State Department bureaucrats be the face of religious liberty, or even a commission be the face of religion. It has to be people who have electoral and political power, because that's what other foreign governments react to. And so one of the reasons I set up the Commission on Religious Liberty was to actually engage a broader group of membership, a bipartisan group of membership, a bicameral group. We actually had House, Senate, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republicans engaged in this issue. We would meet on a regular basis with a variety of different religious groups and NGOs who would come to our meetings and inform members of Congress. We really worked hard to try to get members of Congress to come and listen to what was going on in the world. Because again, you think because you're involved in this area that everybody knows what's going on. And I can tell you most members of Congress have no idea what's going on. They just don't, because it's not a salient issue for their constituents, and so it's not a salient issue for them, just with the odd case that you may care about it and so you pay attention. So the point I'm trying to make is that on a variety of different fronts, the Congress has ceded its authority to the President. The Congress has a role to play in this issue, just like it has a role to play in foreign policy when it comes to our engaging in wars around the world. Congress has a role to play, a constitutional role in that case, but also a moral role when it comes to the issue of religious liberty, but they don't. And you can say, okay, well, how do you change that? How do you get Congress to want to step up? Because what I see, as someone who ran for president, I see Congress increasingly divided, and as a result, ineffective, and as a result, continuing to narrow the scope of what they do because they can't do anything else. And so you say, well, that leads to a lot of frustration and a lot of acrimony. But here's the pitch that I would make to members of Congress on this issue. And I do so from the experience that I had on the commission, on the working group that I put together. I can't think of anything I did as a member of Congress in the international realm, and every member of Congress has some interest in what's going on outside of their congressional district or their state and outside the country. It varies from member to member, but they have some interest. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in Congress. And so how do you spark their interest? How do you get them to engage in this issue? What I found is that I don't know of any other area in which I worked in which a letter from me or a phone call from me or something directly that I did engaging with a foreign government on an issue that I felt more powerful as a little member of the Senate or member of the House than in doing that. Foreign governments don't like to get calls from members of Congress or senators about a problem in their country. They don't. And they react to it. Now, they may react various different ways, but they react. And so what you can appeal to is their sense of importance, because you really do have an opportunity. And this is what Chris Smith has learned, and Frank Wolf. For those are the two guys that Elliot Engel I know has gotten involved in these things on the other side. Is that you have a tremendous amount of cachet as an elected official in this country when you engage with a foreign government on an issue like this. And so I just, if you say, well, what's my hook? How am I going to get people involved? And the answer is, you can make a difference. And in a world today of Congress, where everyone is feeling like they can't make a difference because nothing happens, and there's just constant bickering and fighting, finding a little place where you can make a difference and you can make a mark can be a very attractive thing. So my encouragement for you is to activate Congress. I mean, members of Congress, I talk to a lot of them. I'm not there anymore, but I still interact with a lot of members. And there is a high degree of frustration right now, a huge degree of frustration. And so what you can do is give them an outlet of where they can make a difference, and in not just the life of maybe a particular person that you might be calling about of a religious liberty issue, but on a broader issue, and engage in something that you can use the power of your office as a lever to get things done. So, and it is consonant with the idea that, and I would approach it this way, that Congress has ceded too much to the president. And whether you're a conservative, as I am, who looked at what Barack Obama did and saw what I saw, a rampant abuse of the office of president, and now liberals looking at President Trump and saying rampant abuse of executive orders and things, and both are true, and yet Congress sits and does nothing. Whether it's on the issue of war or whether it's the issue of healthcare regulation, Congress has just become paralyzed. And so the argument, I would say, is that Congress needs to stop the devaluation of your own office. Because that's ultimately what's happening here. Members of Congress are becoming increasingly irrelevant in this town because they can't cooperate, and unless you cooperate in a legislature, you become powerless. And that power then cedes to the executive. Because things are going to happen. Whether what you like or not, they're going to happen. And so it really is an appeal. And you can make the appeal easier now to Democrats than Republicans. 4 years ago, you'd have been making the appeal to Republicans easier than Democrats because of who the president is. You go to a Democrat right now and say, you guys, by the way you're behaving, you're just giving more power to the president. Begin to assert yourself. And the area that you can start and show that you can actually move the administration, and you can, let me assure you, you can, is in the area of religious liberty and directly engage in interacting with other countries. And you don't need the State Department or the White House permission to do it. You can just do it. Members of Congress can just do these things and really have a profound impact. So that's my message today is Congress, stop destroying the constitutional power that the Constitution gave you on a variety of different fronts. Stop minimizing that power. Start using that power to a great degree, and a great place to start is this issue of religious liberty. Thank you all very much, and God bless you. Have a great conference.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to kick off now the panel discussions. Our next discussion is going to be on the topic of the impact of religious liberty and cultural heritage. Dr. Peter Petkoff is going to be our moderator. He's a senior law lecturer at the Brunel Law School, and I think it will be an exciting discussion. So I'm going to leave it up to Peter now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm honored and humbled to be chairing this roundtable on religious cultural heritage because it's also a reunion of old friends and colleagues. And what we all share in common is something which could only be described as an obsession in studying, exploring and debating the different forms and tools and approaches to the protection of religious cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, but particularly religious sacred places, and how these different approaches to religious cultural heritage in different contexts, internationally as well as nationally, in many ways serve as a gateway to developing civic spaces, civic cultures, legal cultures, and how having to pay attention to such approaches is important during times of war, as it is during the times when we live peaceful coexistence. This ministerial has already hosted at least 4 panels on sacred places and their protection in times of war. What we hope that this round table conversation is going to achieve is to look not only on policies and good practices in dealing with protection of religious cultural heritage in armed conflicts, but go beyond there and argue and discuss why it is equally important and perhaps more important to develop long-term, reflective rather than reactive, and very committed policies internationally as well as nationally for the protection of religious cultural heritage through prevention, through developing civic spaces, through developing economic and financial incentives and interdependence between different stakeholders, between states and private parties, between religious and non-religious actors, in order to, in some way, prevent what ultimately military hostilities represent, which is the breakup within the genetic makeup of these civic spaces. And we're going to explore different models, different approaches, different case studies have shared, as well as contested religious cultural heritage sites. And how do we deal with the challenges and the opportunities they present? So this roundtable is not going to focus only on how do we stop destruction of sacred sites, but also how the sacred sites create the robust civic spaces which make hostilities less likely. So we have a stellar panel with us of experts in cultural heritage preservation, UNESCO chairs, former parliamentarians from Turkey, former commissioners of the US Commission of International Religious Freedom, and we all bring different perspectives, different experiences and different perspectives of some of the topics I have already flagged. So, where do we go from here? So, obviously, the big question for all of us, or most of us, would be, why does cultural heritage matter? Is it the archaeological value? Is it the monetary value? Is it the educational value? Why do we bother so much about cultural heritage, and particularly religious cultural heritage? Nobody cared about this 10 or 20 years ago. UNESCO started to think about cultural heritage of religious significance only a few years ago. And now, all of a sudden, cultural heritage almost dominates the agenda of this ministerial. So, why does religious cultural heritage matter? To Vladimir.
Can you all hear me? Well, the answer is actually quite basic. It's part of our presence on this planet. We have identities, and part of our very strong identity is our faith identities. So, religious cultural heritage of any age is kind of proof of our existence on this planet. And the question is whether or not we want to save this for future generations to remember.
Very good. Alberto Meloni, you have acted as a UNESCO chair for a number of years, and you have, in many ways, witnessed the emergence of this new discourse within the UNESCO system, which focuses on cultural heritage and cultural property of religious significance, which was a fairly novel and unusual perspective which UNESCO adopted. The original default position was that UNESCO doesn't do religion. Why do you think this changed?
Well,
It changed because there has been a greatest interest in all multilateral institution and in the public opinion due to a change in our basic culture for a long while between the 60s and the 70s. Many had the idea that religions are something fading away day after day, year after year, that science or other type of issues could have dominated the public arena, and more or less suddenly, at the beginning of the 80s, the things changed. The famous book of a French sociologist called La Revanche de Dieu says that in 1978 there was a turn in the tendency, and what we are experiencing now is a sort of a religious climate change. We have a religious global warming, we have a religious pollution, and all this is made of religion a burning issue. Burning for little violent minorities, but also for great quiet and spiritual majority inside the religious family, and also for the public opinion. And so in this way, even being done in a very illiterated way, the topic of religious heritage has become a new one.
And which brings the next question, which I would address to all speakers. If indeed one of the reasons we are now more interested in religious cultural heritage than ever before, is it really a genuine commitment that this is a very important part of our cultural and genetic makeup? Or is the preventative concern that religious cultural heritage is important because religion is one of the reasons people end up burning each other's houses, and therefore we need to know, understand, protect, control religious cultural heritage to prevent that from happening?
If I may. I think we live in an age where spectacles matter. Spectacles matter for violent extremists to prove that they have gained ground. And the best way to prove that is often genocidal destruction, not only of religious minorities, but also their sacred heritage, but also on the state side or on the intergovernmental organization side. There is also a need to demonstrate responsiveness and accountability by protecting those sites. So in this new age of global transnational conflict and war, religious sites, and particularly religious heritage sites, have become really the focus of not only conflict, but also have become a key signifier, a key spectacle of the deliberation over war, conflict, values, and different policy positions. So interestingly, as you mentioned, there was a time, the First World War, Second World War, where the focus was on maybe protecting religious sites from destruction. But I think now we are in a different era where, yes, there's still that debate going on, but more importantly now, religious sites are not black holes to be excluded from war, but they have become the sites par excellence where deliberation around conflict is taking place.
Elizabeth Brown.
It doesn't disconnect. Okay. It's okay, so it doesn't disconnect. I would say that it's helpful for us to think about how to frame the questions you're asking too, because for all of us around the table, and I'm sure for many in the room, I think history is important. And for anyone who respects and reads and appreciates history, the attention to the preservation and protection of religious and cultural heritage sites is really nothing new. It's just that the international community and the various stakeholders that comprise the protection regimes have come relatively late to the issue. But for anyone who comes from a tradition where those sites matter, the protection and or the destruction of them is something that resonates very personally, and that's why I would go back in particular to Tuba's initial comments. I think why this issue resonates so much is because we're talking about an ontological question. I mean, these sites, cultural and religious, are about our ontology. They give meaning to our very being. And the sites themselves are expressions of that, and they are places where we express our being individually and as part of communities. And the protection and respect for those sites is part of our human dignity, or the disrespect for that, or the loss of that dignity. And the destruction of those sites through both violent and non-violent means is also a way to erase, as you said, to our existence, the fact that we once were, both individually and as communities. And I think, the destruction of those sites, and we've spent a week talking about the links between religious freedom and atrocities, and how violations of freedom of conscience, belief, and religion are harbingers of atrocities, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. Sites are a core component of that. So, the destruction of sites oftentimes comprises what I've called before memoricide, the erasure of any physical evidence that allows a people themselves to remember and pass on intergenerationally that they once were, and also to have acknowledgement from the rest of humanity, and therefore provide the same acknowledgement that they once were. So I think there are deeply personal, but also very long-term historical ways of thinking about sites.
Of course, history is very important. The trouble is that we very often read our histories differently, which makes it very hard to pitch or to project a common sense of public history. And that reflects in many ways the way shared or contested holy sites are approached by stakeholders, by communities which would like to challenge the status quo, but also by states which have in many ways to maintain an equilibrium of peaceful coexistence. Many of the speakers in this panel have done great work on the phenomenon of shared as well as contested sites. And what I would like to ask some of our speakers is to reflect in what ways shared and contested sacred sites are in some way a microcosm which helps us to identify overarching problems which could in many ways inform more robust, more coherent domestic as well as foreign policy by identifying problems as well as opportunities and feed in those problems and opportunities in the format of actionable policy points. Karen?
Okay, good morning, and I'm sorry if my voice is a little rough today, but I have a cold. So I want to take Peter's comment a little back before we start talking about the issue of how do we deal with it. I want to think about a little bit of the importance of shared sacred sites. Many of you might not even know that there are actually across the Mediterranean, for example, hundreds of shared sites where Jews, Muslims, and Christians in groups of two, or the two religions, or the three together, spend time in common rituals, common prayer together in a shrine, in a synagogue, in a different place. This is extraordinary. If we think of the amount of profound belief and emotion that goes into a house of worship, a space that we think of as a religious space, think about it as a shared space where three different or two different religions navigate the space and find all kinds of choreographies for sharing the space. I find this an extraordinary situation. And why is it extraordinary? We need to understand why it's so important before we can even say, I think, this is what we should do about it. First of all, I think the idea that the three different religions and that these spaces are hubs for their accommodation, for their coming together, for their negotiating their otherness in a particular space is extraordinary. They serve as demonstration effect to the world that actually the three religions can get along, and that I think is very powerful. They are, as Elizabeth mentioned already, they are such important markers of historical memory. And I'm not just talking about historical memory that is, about one religion. It's a historical memory that connects us from the time of Abraham on the concept of hospitality, on the concept of being together. So this historical memory is today still important and creates our narratives. It creates, for example, in my work, the narrative of Ottoman cosmopolitanism, of living together as different groups. It is also, these spaces, as a sociologist, I think of them as small spaces of contention also, when people come together and talk about everyday forms of resistance, because they are situated increasingly in countries with governments that are pushing for homogenization, simplification, religious nationalism. So where these groups meet, they become a source of a different form of protest, of enlightenment. So they have multiple functions. And as such, and also let's not forget the economic function, because any moment you have a pilgrimage, you have people who come, and the area of the pilgrimage becomes more vital, there is economic activity, so the place flourishes. So given all these, I think, reasons, these places are so important for us to keep on using as demonstration cases, but also as places where we have a history of coexistence and that we can further enshrine it, further strengthen it, and make it possible to live together. So it's an example of tolerance, and I think that's what we're missing today. So I would say let's start with what is important and then think about what we need to do to protect them.
Thank you.
Victor, would you allow me to provide a flip side?
By all means.
Oh, thank you. and sharing at other times within the framework of conflict I just presented could be actually a marker of state domination. It can be an enforced sharing. I'll give you a couple of examples from the Turkish context, where the Turkish state is an equal opportunity persecutor of pretty much all minority groups across the board. For example, there was some good news coming up, good quote unquote news coming out of Turkey in late 2018, early 2019. The first church to be built from scratch was announced by the Turkish government. It was going to be a Syriac Christian church. So that's news to be celebrated, right? Maybe, because when we take a look at it, it involved an enforced sharing. Because the Turkish state allocated land that it seized back in the 1950s from the Latin Catholic community and allocated that land to the Syriac community for them to build their first mosque from scratch in Istanbul. And in which context? In the immediate aftermath of the news that Turkey was planning a cross-border operation into northeastern Syria, and there was an outcry, first and foremost by the Syriac Christians in the region, but also from other minority religions in the region, saying that a Turkish cross-border operation would be basically the end of those minority communities there. So the Turkish state's diplomatic response was to allocate a Latin Catholic cemetery to be used as the site for a future Syriac Christian church. In fact, throughout this process, the enforced sharing led to conflict between two extremely vulnerable Christian communities in Turkey, as a Catholic priest took the Syriac Christian community to court for that enforced sharing, and ultimately Pope Francis intervened to resolve the conflict, and now the cemetery will be preserved, a Catholic chapel there will be restored, but then on that plot there will be a Syriac Christian church. So sharing at times could also be a symptom of a more sinister state plot that not only involves a certain discriminatory regime toward minorities, but also it could also be a cover-up for kind of cross-border military operations as an attempt to whitewash it. So it's a very complex picture. I don't want to be the pessimist in the room, but I love taking a look at it from both angles.
And no doubt we have to actually think of the role of the state in all of these cases, whether they are from below places that started historically to be shared or not. The state is an important actor in this, so the point is very well taken.
Alberto and then Elizabeth. Yeah.
If I may, I'd like to add a dot of historical pessimism and on that, because I think there is something that we must remember. We are not speaking about innocent lambs in a world of wolves. We are speaking about wolves. The people that destroyed the Cathedral of Reims during the First World War were destroying a secret place very explicitly, and this is part of propaganda. And if you don't want to go back to Theodosius II, the history of the great religious family has been a history of destruction and possess of the sacred symbols of the other ones. And so, what makes me think that we have always to remember that when we speak about otherness and religious difference, we are speaking in a realm in which there is a great sense of responsibility. We are in the Museum of the Bible, and we all are aware of the third verse of Genesis, when God divides the water over the earth and the water under earth. And there is a famous Talmudic commentary who asks why the waters that are upstairs doesn't fall down, and when the waters are down, doesn't go up. And this is because they have responsibility and the separation of the two things. It is real freedom and responsibility. And so when we speak about sacred place, we have also to remember that there is a part that you may call negotiation, that you may call wisdom, that you may call sainthood, that requires the comprehension of what is at stake in that. And on this level, I think that a more careful use of language could be proper. I'm one of those who have a certain suspicion against the wording cultural heritage. Because to have a heritage, you have that somebody who died, and this without one an heritage. And on the contrary, mostly when we speak about religious community, there is no heritage at all. That is a patrimony, that is a spiritual capital, that is a living, something that is very ontological, as you said, said. And so the problem is not like the Dolomites, what we can leave of the Dolomites to the next generation. In a few millions here, nothing, of course, who cares of the millions here, but for tomorrow morning, we can leave a sense of peace. And for me, it's important the mention of war that we make in this panel, because the choice between war and peace is exactly a matter of Allah. It's a matter of political choices.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. Yeah, on the shared spaces, I want to be an optimist, but I also think that it's important to recognize the challenges. And I think one of the issues or the features that's most important about whether or not shared spaces actually become spaces of resolution, integration, and ultimately peace, or the opposite, depends on the origins of sharing. And I think there are two ways we can think about the origins of sharing. One is sites that are shared sites because of the effects of violent war. So sites where there was a previous, religious or cultural monument, and those who came destroyed it purposely to, humiliate and eliminate, so homogenize, or via non-violent means of appropriation and expropriation. And I think that is a particularly insidious way of producing homogenization or forced sharing. And then there are sites that are shared sites because they were deliberately constructed that way. And I think, whether we're thinking about religious sites or what we can call secular sites, national monuments, which are thoughtfully constructed as ways of integrating and including, and therefore can be sources for respecting pluralism. And so I think the how, under what circumstances, and who created the origin moment of sharing becomes especially important for the role of the state and civil society actors in addressing the sharedness as a possibility for resolution of deep wounds, and for recognition of the importance and the vitality that's generated by pluralism, or exactly the opposite, for the continuation of those, deep traumas and the impossibility of those spaces being shared, and in fact they then become symbolic of ongoing efforts to eliminate one or others.
Tuba, would you like to add?
Actually, perfect point. And I wanted to talk about the resolution of deep wounds too. I am kind of in the spectrum of pessimism to optimism. I started my career in terms of religious cultural heritage from the side of pessimism, and we had been working on contested converted religious sites, which actually within themselves not only carry the memory of our human existence on this planet, but also the memory of some of the most violent conflicts that had happened between different communities. So as a heritage specialist, you have to understand that these monuments are testimony to multiple different facts of life. That yes, at a certain point, they may have been emblems of coexistence. At certain other points, they may have been the kind of most significant reminders of violent conflicts. Within this whole spectrum trajectory that is around sacred sites, what do we do so that we make sure they contribute to peace in the future and not to violence? And this is where, as heritage specialists, we have a lot to learn. Because Alberto might be on the same page with me on this, I think, that the discipline of heritage studies started with the concept of preserving physical remains, which I think is very important, and don't understand me wrong, I fully respect all the professionals in the field who do the very minute work to do this. But at the same time, we have to come to the realization that these physical things are not merely physical for many people, for most people, that they are actually emotionally charged artifacts and monuments. To that end, what we do with them, how do we tell the story of them, how do we work on preserving, conserving, restoring them, is a very tricky issue. And on that, to promote peace and kind of use them as a way of resolve deep wounds, a way of using them as sanctuaries where we can actually come to terms with past violence and go beyond it, there are a couple of things we need to do. And it requires a very large cooperation. It has to have the communities themselves, But by communities, we have again a complex issue. In that, in most cases, you have to include all communities that have been either the perpetrators or the victims of the same violence. You have to include religious leaders. You have to include secular institutions like heritage regimes, in certain times local governance, states and interstate actors. So it becomes a very, very, very complicated issue. And to the best of my knowledge, we haven't got kind of like a very beautiful, stellar example that I can tell you, but we're on the way. Two things we need to learn along the way is, one of them, we need to negotiate, and in negotiation we need to compromise. So negotiation is the good part, compromise is the bad part. But the good news is that the longer the process is, the more actors get involved. And you can use that process of interaction into a larger peace-building mechanism.
And in fact, the dialogical spaces you talk about are very novel in the whole approach to cultural property protection, and the UNESCO initiative for cultural property of religious significance for the first time flags this importance and interdependence between the role of the states under international law and the new role of the stakeholders, the communities, which make these cultural property sites working sites rather than museum sites. And I also know that Tuba has done a lot of work of one of the most fascinating cultural heritage sites, which is also a UNESCO site, which is Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And she's finishing a great book on Hagia Sophia, from church to museum to mosque and back to mosque again, which flags the whole question of how do we navigate this multiple identities, not just shared spaces, but also spaces which have multiple identities. And
this is a challenging question, but let me start by correcting one little thing. Yes, Turkish President Erdogan made a public statement that he thought he could open Hagia Sophia as a mosque. But you have to contextualize that statement. That was during an election period, and he was actually using Hagia Sophia to see whether or not he could gain votes by that move. As it happened, Erdogan had the worst defeat of his political career in that election, so that kind of political move did not serve him well, I can tell. But the fact that Hagia Sophia was used in a political plot like that tells a lot about the nature of the monument. It was, from its first instance, it was a Byzantine imperial monument to show the power of the Byzantine emperor. So as beautiful as it is, as magnificent as it is, Hagia Sophia has always been part of this political it is a political spectacle, but political ebb and flow between different actors. And in that, for monuments like Hagia Sophia that have kind of been at the core of multiple discussions by multiple actors, I believe there is a great role for the international community to be in. If it is a monument of our human heritage, we have to make sure that it stays that way. And there is no actual golden rule in that, I would argue. And its museumified status at the moment is kind of like the status quo in Jerusalem, that it may not be the perfect solution, but it keeps it out of active conflict. So I would defend it for 21st century, early 21st century, to stay in that line.
But going back to my question, that you could, Studian Monastery, which is part of the Hagia Sophia Museum, is apparently projected not to be part of the UNESCO site anymore.
and it will reopen as an operational mosque, which means that technically the state could decide that something which is a UNESCO site could no longer be a UNESCO site and could be an operational religious site. Does that make the UNESCO protection system virtually redundant in contexts like Turkey and any similar context when the state could actually choose to override international commitments?
It does. And that's the sad part, that we do have international legislation or ways of protecting these sites, or we think we do. But like the human rights regime, you may have the European Court of Human Rights passing judgments on countries across Europe in terms of human rights, and the countries may not be listening to what international law says. Similar with the cultural heritage regime, international and national. Again, in an area of global cooperation that can go beyond just the traditional players, we have to find out ways of cooperating globally to make sure we can do more to protect these sites.
Elizabeth, would you like to add?
This is probably a continuation of our dinner conversation the other evening. And the example of Hagia Sophia, I think it's indicative of another important piece of this discussion. I think that we need to recognize that the economics of how shared sites are utilized also matters. And in particular, sacred sites or cultural heritage sites, cultural sites oftentimes are commercialized, both by states but also by private actors, in a way that I think is profoundly degrading. And I find both intellectually and as a policy person and personally particularly repugnant. And we had an interesting session yesterday on sacred sites and holy places in the Middle East. And one of the things that those who spoke there emphasized is that these are just not stones, but these are spaces of living communities, and that they would want these sites to be spaces of living communities rather than simply monuments to dead communities or what has passed. And oftentimes the monuments to dead communities then become commercialized as tourist sites, etc. Having just come back from Jerusalem and met with many of the heads of churches in Jerusalem, they talked about the difference between the language, as you said, Alberto, before, about the language of tourism versus pilgrimage, and one is clearly commercial, and the other is clearly has a kind of sacred or identity component to it. And then in terms of the case of Hagia Sophia, I think it's also instructive. I wouldn't say that Hagia Sophia was simply a political monument. Hagia Sophia was a church in the center of the Orthodox Church in the East for centuries. So it's important to recognize that it was that. But also I think Hagia Sophia is iconic. Every James Bond movie you may go to, you'll see a backdrop of Hagia Sophia, or every, whatever, pick your Tom Cruise adventure Mission Impossible movie, there's Hagia Sophia in the background. And yet the viewing public, now the planetary viewing public, has no idea what this place was. And so they see it as part of perhaps of contemporary Turkish history or Ottoman history, but don't know anything about the previous history. And this goes back to what I'm saying about how the moment of origin of sharedness and how that's discussed and how it's resolved. Because otherwise sharedness becomes a form of appropriation and erasure. And I think, Tuba, your point about maybe we don't have perfect solutions. We can only have, least worst solutions. And those least worst solutions then become the possibility for, more, positive solutions. So we have to think incrementally in terms of the time frame.
On the commercialization, can I just add one point? Now, commercialization of sacred sites, especially shared sacred sites, could also be a relic of an earlier conflict and an imprint of a dominating state. My academic expertise is on Turkey's largest religious minority, namely the Alevi community. This is a Muslim minority that's roughly 10% of Turkey's population. And one of their most sacred sites is the shrine of Hacı Bektaş, their kind of founding patron saint, also of the Bektashi order. And in 2016, when the Ottomans banned the order and basically destroyed both in terms of the religious order and organization as well as their sacred sites, this shrine was handed over to a Sunni religious order, and a mosque was built within the complex. And that was the sign of domination by the majority sect of a minority community. And now that site has been commercialized. It is a museum akin to Hagia Sophia, but then with one fine kind of nuance that you can read in a book Karen edited and Tuba contributed a great chapter to. Because if you are now visiting that site, if you want to worship at the mosque, you don't need a ticket. But if you are a follower of the Bektashi order, or if you're an Alevi, going to one of your holiest sites, first of all, you're not allowed to worship because your ritual hall, your worship hall has been museumified, unlike the mosque. But more importantly, you have to buy a ticket. So the state, in a way, reiterates every time you visit this site, whether you are a member of the majority or minority, whether you can worship or not, whether you have to pay or not. So in a way, it is iconic, not as a backdrop to a James Bond movie, but it's iconic in a way that it projects the sectarian regime in Turkey to everyone who comes to the site so clearly that you can't get it wrong.
And I would like to steer the conversation in the direction of some of the overarching themes which are emerging, which is the role of the state, the way the state could choose to steer policies in direction of commercialization or religious Disneyland, or in the direction of control of particular religious associations by promoting or dissuading from shared spaces. Turkey is one example. The Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba is another example of a municipality choosing to use the UNESCO designation of a cathedral mosque as a heritage site to allow the Muslims to enter and share the cathedral with the Catholic Church as a political act. How does that create cohesion, social and cultural, and how does that create conflict? So what, and it raises another very big question, whether our approaches to cultural property and cultural heritage protection is likely to be divided between the extreme approach of China, where the state owns everything and allows usage or management of religious sites, and the other extreme, which is US or Israel approaches, where the religious sites are managed and imagined through the lens of the recognition of right to private property, with the rest of the world operating with some kind of hybrid models in one or another. So the question is, what's the role of the state? Should the state always have central and dominant role in the preservation of religious cultural property? Or should there be a balance between private and public actors, religious and non-religious actors, in doing that? And what would a coherent, robust policy which could articulate good practices of creating such balance could be? Thoughts?
You're asking me?
The panel.
I have a very hard time with a question that really focuses on the state, because my instinct, my sociological instinct, my more European social democracy instinct in that tradition uh, pushes for state intervention. Yet the contemporary scene that we have of states that have been hijacked and dominated by religious nationalist, populist, authoritarian leaders, whether we're talking of Turkey, Hungary, Russia, Israel, all these places, tells me otherwise, because then the agenda of the state is so powerfully, constructed by a dominant ideology. It's very problematic. I have always thought that the state should act, and just to actually explain where I come from, I have never actually been part of, up to now today, any discussion that has to do with cultural heritage, UNESCO, or any kind of policy discussions. I am an academic who thinks about how to really put out their knowledge that is helpful to policy actors perhaps, but also to high schools and universities for teaching purposes and creating communities of knowledge. That's what I think about. I don't think more in terms of these larger institutions, but I've always thought that the state has a very important role to play in the protection of sites, in the how do you say, sustaining of historical memory and historical projects, in collaboration with civil society actors, religious actors. It cannot be the state itself, just the state. It has to be a state that is contested from various angles and that engages in society and in civil society. That's my motto. But here is where I'm completely pessimistic, is that I don't see with the contemporary political scene that states are going to be useful at that. So that's where I think what we need to do, and that's part of the response to also the projects that you were talking about. I think that we need to produce joint projects between various, in the case of these religious issues, religious contenders, joint projects that tell history from multiple sides, that put it together into one document that makes it available more publicly. We have an incredible now tool that we have left, in a sense, to the more negative. The social media, the internet is being used, websites is being used to create conflict. And we, the actors who could actually put more material out there, don't do enough, I think, in using the tools we have to bring groups together and create positive knowledge. The Israelis and Palestinians tried to do it, it stopped. In the Balkans, there were joint history high school books that started as a project, it stopped. So we keep attempting these things, and I think what we need to do is a more general framework for doing this. The role of the state, how do we temper this? How do we deal with this new political situation that we live in? I don't want the Erdogan state to be part of this.
But even outside of Balkan or Turkish context or Chinese context, the real question is how do we keep the state in and the same out? Most of the legal tools
Our
which
state,
we use rely on international responsibilities of state actors to implement cultural heritage protection. And this is part of the problem. In a country like Israel, most of the religious communities really hate cultural heritage protection because they mistrust the state and they believe that any form of cultural heritage is an excuse for the state to step in and assert sovereignty on their sides. And if you ask religious associations in Israel what they want in order to have their right to religious freedom protected, they say, as long as you recognize, or the state recognizes our right to private property, we'll be able to exercise our religious freedom, which also means that we choose when to invite people into our sites and when to kick them out, because
and that
we want to
creates
use them for something
conflict.
else. Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, that's not the solution.
But it also flags sensitive dynamics which we don't always recognize and acknowledge when we talk about policy. We're very quick to jump into the conclusion that we really need a state to be able to act and implement those policies, and very often forget that in places like northern India, for example, Tibetan Buddhists would find the very idea that their sites could be protected by a state or by somebody other than the community themselves to be completely alien and also offensive. So unless we actually start building much more comprehensive narrative of how different forms of negotiating those spaces could look like, we would never be able to come up with comprehensive strategies.
I have a question to ask. Because when it comes to states and governance, scale really matters. How do I know? Because I know Tuba has wonderful research at the Surp Giragos Armenian Church, which demonstrates the importance of scale. You know, local governance versus central state governance, delivering diametrically opposite results. So let me put her on the spot. She's willing to share that research.
This was, in my career, the closest I got to a pretty, awesome example. And I will tell you the whole story. So, Surp Giragos is an Armenian church that is located in a city called Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey. And the church was built in the 17th century when there was a significant Armenian population in the region. And of course, as many of you know, Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey have suffered unimaginable traumas during the genocide. So the population had decreased by 1915 to a very small fraction of what it used to be. So Giragos, at the time when it was functioning, it was the largest Armenian church in the Middle East. And it was a very important center for manuscript production. So throughout Turkish history, unfortunately, after 1915, there were multiple times when the lives of religious minorities in the region was endangered. So by 1980s, the church had been into an almost ruined form. There were only 8 families living in Diyarbakir by that time, and with the death of the last priest, the church was completely left without any community. So in 2010, when Turkey was in the way of EU accession, so the government was a lot more interested in taking care of religious minorities and shoving that off to the EU. And there were also the local elections, which meant the pro-Kurdish Progressive Party took control over the municipality in Diyarbakir. And one of the things, as part of their new new way of showing tolerance, was that they wanted to have a more inclusive way of integrating all the religious communities living in Diyarbakir and those who were not at that time living in Diyarbakir too. So the mayor invited the remaining families who had by then had all moved to Istanbul to come back and restore their church. Now, in this example, at that time when the church was being restored, there were only a few people of Armenian identity living in Diyarbakir that could openly say that they were Armenian and worshipping. But the community in Istanbul engaged in a global fundraising campaign. They were somewhat successful with the help and financial help of the local government. They were able to actually open the doors of the church for active worship in 2011. And that was a very important point in Turkish history, in Turkey's kind of facing back what happened during the genocide, the trauma of 1915. The local mayor invited all the communities. The Armenian community arranged the liturgy. So it was a very emotional point. It brought together communities that were not necessarily had been together before. I'm talking about the perpetrators of violence in 1915, the grandkids of the people who actually killed Armenians, and Armenian families coming together for the first time under the roof of a restored church, and praying together and crying together and trying to build a better future so that those traumas, those wounds would not reopen again. We were there in 1915 for the Easter liturgy, and Chaldean Christians, Catholics, Turkish Muslims, and Armenians prayed together. It was one of the most beautiful sights, one of the most beautiful and effective restoration processes that I've ever witnessed in terms of building peace in the region. That was the first time, like university students, lay people who would come to the church and would just hang out and talk to others. And some of them would witness what the other families had been going through. Some of them would confess to the crimes that their great-grandfathers had committed. This is that is a point of reconciliation, coming to terms of the pain of the past. Now, the reason why it is not anymore the most important and amazing and beautiful project of the restoration is that in September 2015, right after the general elections in Turkey, there was an armed conflict between the Turkish military and the local Kurdish armed forces that lasted for about 6 months, and the whole old city was kind of ruined in a very terrible way. And I have a slide, and you can see in the slide that it's almost like a moonscape. It was a very painful destruction. And the church kind of remained beyond access to not only to Armenian community, but for heritage specialists, anybody who wanted to go and investigate for about 3 years. The negotiations to rebuild it again are just getting started, but on a different way. Now the Turkish government wants to be kind of the leading force in the restoration, which is very different. In 2011, the community had decided that they did not want to have any financial help from the Turkish government. They wanted to be in charge of the restoration and in charge of the faith of the church. Now the Turkish government wants to be the leading force in doing this restoration process. I'm still watching it. I'm not as optimistic as I was in the Easter of 2015, but nevertheless, we have to figure out what are the variables, what are the best practices that we can replicate in the future, and what are the things that we should avoid. And also we have to have the very solemn conscious that conflict is somewhat inevitable. It may come, it may go away. What do we do to make sure we live in peace as long as we can? And then what do we do after that?
And Tuba's reflection also reminds us of the question about the tools. What are the tools? Indeed, in the emerging discourses about religious cultural property protection, using transitional justice forms of mediation, such as the one you already outlined, is seen as one of the tools. There are plenty of declarations, soft law instruments such as the Common Grounds Project and the Code of Protection of Holy Sites, the Declaration of the Knights of Malta for the protection of sacred places in the Mediterranean. And there appears to be an emerging consensus that we cannot make much sense or use very effectively the vast plethora of international law tools with teeth which never worked, but we could perhaps connect them in a much more informal and more comprehensible way through these soft law tools, through declarations, through toolkits, through guidelines, which may help policymakers on the ground to make more sense of what they already have. And it also raises the questions, how do we avoid duplication? All these organizations doing pretty much the same thing, replicating the same thing. The other day we had another session on cultural property protection, and one of the speakers was praising the great achievements of the Potomac Plan of Action of proposing a list of protected sites, only to be reminded that this approach existed since the First World War, and there is a broad international consensus that it was highly unsuccessful. So why do we need to go in the direction of things which have failed? And we know that they don't work. So what other directions do we take? Who participates in these conversations? Is this a policymakers' conversation, or is it a three-tier conversations of religious stakeholders, heritage experts and lawyers, and policymakers? I know that ICANN has been part of the very important International Parliamentarians Partnership on freedom of religion and belief. Do you think that this kind of format of international parliamentarians in the MENA region and beyond, heritage experts and lawyers, may be a model which we should seek to replicate in relation to religious cultural property?
So very quickly, let me address that, because I think, as you know, I brought the issue of scale. Local governments matter a lot. Bringing local stakeholders matters a lot. But at the same time, on the other end of the scale, it's very important to bring in these international instruments. They can be, as concrete as the European Court of Human Rights or the United Nations, or they can be as nimble and as informal as the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, IPP4, of which I'm one of the founding and steering committee members. Now, in that experience of ours, the reason we chose not to be an intergovernmental or international formal organization, but a network, interested more in a soft approach, kind of a soft legal approach, was that there are different levels to engage one of the key perpetrators of violence and atrocities, that is the state, the nation state. And our approach was, for example, bringing legislators from around the world, across the political spectrum and from different faiths, to work together for what you might call as part of an attempt, in some respects, to shame, and in other aspects, in other cases, to basically commend. And one of the key tools we had, and this might come to you, as a very weak tool, a very soft tool, was our letter campaign. We asked members of our network to write letters to heads of state, to ambassadors of that state serving in their countries on key religious freedom issues. It could be a religious heritage site, it could be the imprisonment of an American pastor, such as the North Carolina pastor Andrew Brunson. And in our experience, this had a disproportionate impact compared to some of the more hard approaches, such as, for example, a conviction by the European Court of Human Rights. Because this kind of shaming, and you can imagine what happens when 50 ambassadors of a persecuting state receives letters from lawmakers, when the head of state of that country receives lawmakers from around the world, from Brazil to Australia, from Norway to South Africa, they do pay attention. It might not be a genuine attention, it might not be a genuine transformation of thinking, but it could simply be a response to avoid that kind of global kind of shaming and a global moral majority. So I think that could be one of the ways in which we can complement. I'm not offering this as the tool. I think what we need here is a complementarity across different levels, different scales. But again, going back to Surgiragos' case, what I learned the most from that case is local matters profusely, even in cases which happen to be extremely transnational and globally connected. If you can bring in the mayor, the city councillor, the local stakeholders, it provides a protection no military can, no militia can. Because at Surgiragos, when you had a pro-Kurdish mayor who has a strong rapport with the local Kurdish Muslims, many of whom are descendants of genocide perpetrators, that provided that church the strongest protection it has ever witnessed in a century, because the average man on the street, the average woman on the street there, no matter how humble a background, of how humble a background he or she comes from, was one of the protectors of the church as a neighbor, as a good neighbor, and that was as important as a UN peacekeeping force.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we're at a point where we have some of the most extensive and comprehensive legal regimes which have been developed, and Alberto, you probably know more than anyone on this panel about that, legal regimes for regulating, protecting cultural and religious heritage. But I think the real question, and states are signatories to some of those conventions, and I think the real problem becomes, however, where states are involved, the question of enforcement. And this takes me in some ways back to the commercialization piece, because although we've spoken a lot about protection of sites, we've spoken less, I think, about the deconstruction of sites, and then the looting and black marketing of antiquities and of artifacts. So the failure to use enforcement mechanisms to penalize those who participate in that looting and black marketing and trafficking, I think, is one of the failures of states collectively and individually. And we all know that institutions and individuals respond to their pocketbook being affected. And so without implementation mechanisms that impose very, very serious fines and also associated penalties, including imprisonment for trafficking in these artifacts, I think we're going to continue to fall short. And I think that's where, again, the private sector comes in, because, we've been speaking about, regimes that are either authoritarian or quasi-democratic, but, democracies have to do some heavy lifting. And we all know that in democracies, elected officials are very much connected to private sector interests. And so those private sector interests need to be held accountable and private sector actors who participate in either the commercialization in a positive, well, I don't know if there's a positive way, commercialization in a transparent way or commercialization in an illegal way by trafficking in these artifacts. And then also just one footnote to Karen, your point about social media. I think the media as well has to be integrated more effectively into these conversations on enforcement mechanisms, because ultimately the media either shapes and covers in an informative way, or covers in an occluding way, in the Saidian sense of the word, how these processes work. And the huge media coverage of the atrocities, the violence against the mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the media coverage of the collapse of Notre Dame, they were interesting for the way in which they treated the question of religion and sacredness of sites. And I think, again, the media needs to be integrated more deliberately and systematically into the way in which people understand the importance of these sites, but also the issue of trafficking in looted artifacts.
Alberto, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to add something about two aspects. One, the mention, the discussion on the state, and the other on the site. Because one of the points for me is very relevant when we speak about cultural, religious patrimony and heritages, is to be aware of the fact that we are speaking about tangible, physical objects, and also at the same time about contents. What Tubor was saying about Hagia Sophia is in this sense that there is an exhibition of Byzantine power that must be appreciated, not to be moralistic against or in favor of, but just to taste what is the proper grammar of the object. And there are aspects of cultural heritage that even more complex and intangible, and those that come back to the title of our panel, the impact of war. In North Iraq and in Syria, war has destroyed the capacity of monasteries, mostly, and other institutions to protect manuscripts. And what happened there is that a good number of academic institutions and university has done the worst and the best at the same time. So they came and they said, well, don't worry, we can digitize it. So they digitized a good number of manuscripts of the Syriac patrimony. Now this patrimony is available in Paris, in Oxford, in Harvard, in Princeton, in Berkeley. And the people there has been deprived for the ownership and the value of what they had, of the meaning of these things in their place, for good reasons, for an act of insane compassion. And this says that when you touch the things, the complication is very great, and to a certain extent, we can discuss a couple of hours what means to a certain extent. State, even the worst state, and the legal tradition is a way of protecting things also beyond the moral quality of those who are in power in a certain moment. And on this issue of content, I think there is something to reflect on, because we can use even the category of protection or even good action of protection and create counter effect and rebound effect that can be very dangerous. And so, being myself part of an academic community, I have nothing to do with the UNESCO sites. I'm UNESCO chair in religious pluralism and peace, that has a completely different approach, and I myself am a church historian working excited with very narrow topic and specialistic topic. In my view, one of the things that has to be very clear is that we want to have an effective protection of this. We have to protect the object and the content, the language and the grammar, the preservation of the physical resistance and sustainability of the site, and also the capacity to understand it for its proper meaning. Because when I wanted to amuse some of our Italian politicians, I remember to them that sooner or later some tourists will come in the Cathedral Square of Milan looking at the Golden Madonna over the cathedral. They think that is a girl dressed by Cavalli, that is one of our luxury brand that is used to have very baroque things. Last point on this. This means that we have to think not only to protect the site that exists, but also to create sites that are sacred not because of the fact that the physical aspect is there, but the content is part of this sacred place. If you go to Facebook, the Abbot of Alcoche has created a profile for the Scriptorium Syriacum. That is something that we launched together when I had the chance to discover in one of his houses in North Iraq a manuscript that for us is very famous. It's the Baghdad 509. It is the only surviving manuscript of the Syriac liturgical, canonical, and conciliar tradition that apparently was lost in 1742, but simply because since 1742 the monks, that are wise persons, denied to have the manuscript and told the story that it was burned by somebody persecuting the monastery. And now this is going to this place, and it is interesting to know that the position of the Holy See on the Scriptorium Syriacum is very cold, because they say you are building a target. In the next few centuries, they think like that, in the next few centuries, this will be also a target, not only a place of protection. And to speak about protection in war means also the possibility to create that and to do this. And yesterday I was saying to one of the people of the Department of State on Cultural Heritage in North Iraq, there is also a matter of restitution of cultural heritage. We have the libraries in Great Britain, in France, in the United States, full of manuscripts that comes from the Middle East. Sometimes the 19th century robbery has been physically taken away from there. Nowadays it's much more a matter of digital robbery, but it's also the same. And the Antioch Patriarch of the Syriac is hoping, it is very naive in this may be, but it's a good way to spend his time, is hoping that sooner or later somebody will launch the idea to restitute to the Syriac Church, at least in digital form, the patrimony of the Epistolets, in order to recreate a critical mass that will be very intangible, because it will be on a cloud in Iceland or I don't know where, but it will be very intangible but very proper at this point. This will be also a good way for us to remember how things may work. To make another example far from Christianity, Professor Tucci was a famous Italian Tibetologist of the 40s, has taken pictures of the bamboo collection of Buddhist texts that have been burned with the Cultural Revolution. And so the only way for Chinese to have access to this patrimony is to have the copies of this, and of course Italy has given it back a copy very quickly and properly. But this is also a way to recreate not simply a static defense, but also a dynamic exchange.
And your reflection also indicates the important interdependence which was emerging throughout the whole conversation between financing streams, financial sustainability, and religious cultural property and religious cultural heritage.
a theme which, for some reason, is escaping the public discourses, at least at the policy level, which is the discourses there are focused primarily on protection of cultural sites from bombing and destruction, mapping cultural sites where they are digitally through satellite imaging, and there is a very little energy and commitment to actually studying the few case studies which are about economic and financial interdependence between different and potentially rival religious communities, such as the monasteries in Kosovo which produce wine but buy the grapes from Albanian Muslims, or the sustainable farming in Georgia, and so on and so forth. We have done very little to actually study more closely how these shared and contested forms of religious coexistence also develop not just civic spaces but economic and financial opportunities, which also grow the communities to learn from each other and depend on each other rather than being hostile because one community is more prosperous than the other. So a lot more to discuss, but like all good things, this beautiful conversation has to come to an end. Thank you for all the speakers who shared with us their reflections on new approaches and existing approaches to religious cultural heritage preservation and the ways forward. Let's thank you to the panelists and feel free to stay around and continue these conversations informally.